Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Abel Wang and Damian Brady. Abel is a senior cloud developer advocate specializing in DevOps and Azure with a background in application development, and Damian is an Australian CDA specializing in DevOps. He's currently in the process of moving back to Australia, the land of the dangerous creatures and beautiful beaches. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. And I just realized that that's slightly out of date. I am in Australia now.
Fantastic.
That was a quick move for you.
It was, yeah, very quick. Since the start of that sentence.
So one of the things we just ask is, why don't you guys kind of, before we talk about DevOps and kind of get into the meat of things, would you guys just like give a little bit of your story and just kind of how you got started? Maybe you can one at a time. Damian, why don't you take it away first?
Sure. So I've been a developer for professionally about 18 years, I think it is now. And I basically started, I did a degree at university, information technology degree, and I started, there was no Microsoft stuff in that degree at all. And then my first job was writing VB.NET for the government in Australia, which was fun. And a bunch of jobs after that. And I kind of just went into this DevOps path. I worked for Octopus Deploy for a few years before I joined Microsoft, and that kind of got me really interested in DevOps especially. And I did some consulting before that, lots of agile stuff as well. So I guess by trade, I'm a .NET, like ASP.NET developer. I did switch to C#. I'm not writing VB.NET anymore. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
We can keep the podcast going.
Yeah, I saw your finger over the big red button to cover. No, I've actually done training for people in the past for VB.NET. That was interesting, actually. I thought it was C#, and then absolutely last minute they said, no, we're VB.NET, so I rewrote everything. But you know, it's one of those languages. So that's kind of my programming background, and then lots of agile, lots of DevOps, and now I'm at Microsoft talking about that all the time, which is cool.
Cool. And you, Abel?
So I didn't want anything to do with computers or computer science. My mom was a computer science professor, right? So I was like, the last thing I wanted to do was computers. I wanted to be a rock star. And I had 100% certainty I was going to be a rock star. And I kind of failed at that. So apparently I wasn't quite good enough, because that career ended horribly, like on a couch in someone else's house, and I was homeless. And I was like, maybe that computer science degree will come in handy, because I'm really hungry right now. So I went back to school and got my computer science degree. What's kind of funny was when I left college, I ended up working for a company called Marimba. So I ended up working for Arthur Van Hoff, the guy who invented Java. So I was all Java. I'm really old, so this was the early 90s. And I was so anti-Microsoft. There was no way you could have told me in the future you would be working for Microsoft, right? So I was all Java, all open source, until I met Donovan. So this was close to like about 20 years ago. And this was when .NET first dropped. And he was like, you've got to check this out, right? So he gives me a stack of 6 CDs, because it was one. And I loaded it up. My first thought was, oh, .NET looks just like Java. This is just Microsoft copying Java. And my next thought was, I was like, I might as well build something. So I built a web service. Wow, this was so ridiculously easy. Visual Studio, right? Right click, bam, you're done. And in the Java world, I would have had to download the right library, set the right class path, right? Do all sorts of nonsense before I could even just get stuff going. So then I was like, oh, maybe Donovan's right. Maybe this .NET thing has some legs to it. So I started playing around with it, and next thing you know, here I am talking about .NET, talking about Java, talking about DevOps into Azure all the time.
So we're recording this on September 10th, and there was a big announcement today from Microsoft in the Azure realm. Do you want to kind of share what that was and what that means to the community?
You go, Abel.
I'll go ahead. The big announcement is we rebranded VSTS and now it's Azure DevOps. And not only did we rebrand it, we actually split it up into 5 separate services. So now, you can have pipelines, you can have your repositories, you can have just stuff, something that just tracks your work item tracking. So we, just test and repos and things like that. But the cool thing is they all work together seamlessly. But if you don't want to use all pieces, maybe you only want to use the pipeline, you absolutely can as well. And the other huge announcements with Azure DevOps is we are pretty much the ultimate tool for open source projects, right? If you are an open source project, guess what? We will give you 10 parallel pipelines for free. And the secret that I think nobody has actually said out loud, so I'll say it, is if you have more than 10 parallel pipelines that you need, just give us a call and we'll give it to you.
Nice.
So that's freaking amazing, right? And of course, Azure DevOps, it works for Windows, Mac, and also Linux. So no matter what operating system you're using or what platform you're trying to deploy into, of course, we want you to deploy into Azure, right? But any language, any platform. So that's the big news that came out.
Yeah, for me, the biggest part of that about that is the open source stuff. Like it's the Azure pipelines is kind of the big draw card here. And so if you have a public project in GitHub, and I think the intention is public project anywhere, right? If you have a public project anywhere, you can set up a pipeline. So your CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous testing, whatever tasks you want to run, and we'll run it on hosted agents. So you don't need any of your own infrastructure at all. And then deploy to anywhere. So you could have like a Java project in Bitbucket that compiles on a Ubuntu machine and then gets deployed to AWS if you want. And Azure DevOps will do that for free with the hosted agents. I mean, don't do that because we need money. Also,
I have more cars I need to buy.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's like it's any language, any platform. So we're not going to actively try and push you to Azure. I mean, it works really well with Azure, but it's whatever project you have and totally free for open source, which is kind of cool.
That's awesome. That makes me kind of wonder. So I didn't know about the whole rebranding thing that was going on. I've been busy playing with streaming software all day. With that, is there a way to have a public what used to be VSTS repo?
Yeah, I think Abel probably knows a little bit more about that, but I know that you can expose a lot of the stuff as publicly. So, for example, if you have a look at the VS Code repository, they have public visibility into their build process. So not just the build badge, but also the the process of how that went. You can drill into that and see a bit more. There's also what we call a stakeholder license, which is also free. It just means that you don't have the ability to edit the builds. You can see them and you can trigger them and you can read the results and all that sort of stuff. And that's free as well. So we're exposing a lot of this stuff publicly for public projects.
So the really cool thing is you can even create you can make your project public. And once it's public, then anybody can go in there and see your builds. Depending on how you set up your permissions, they can issue pull requests and things like that as well. They can't edit the build, thank goodness. You don't want them to edit the builds, but they can actually see the builds being fired and the logs from the builds as well.
Well, what about the YAML builds? Like if they snuck a pull request in on you and you had a YAML build.
Hopefully you'll catch that in your pull request.
So, I mean, it integrates really well with GitHub, for example, because, I mean, GitHub is kind of the place for open source stuff. There's an extension that we released at the same time for GitHub, which basically means that you can set up a pipeline in Azure DevOps incredibly quickly from your GitHub repo. But all of the things you might want to do, like PR checks and, gates if it's in, sorry, not gates, what are they called in Azure repos? Abel, build policies. That's the one.
Yeah.
Or branch policies.
Branch policies.
Yeah. Branch policies in Azure DevOps, and then in GitHub, I think they're checks or PR checks or something like that. Yeah. So you can actually trigger a build as part of that PR process and work exactly the same way as you would for an open source project in GitHub. It's just that Azure DevOps is doing your pipeline now.
Awesome.
So what does this mean for the on-premise folks? Is there any change with the offerings for those guys?
So the product is the same. I believe it's being renamed as well, Azure DevOps Server. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly the same product as before. I mean, that is a box product, so it's something you install on your infrastructure. So the licensing for that, I believe, is exactly the same as it was. If you need to install that on your own infrastructure, then you need a license for that, the same as before. You'd think as well with open source projects having a on-prem build server as well. Not as common, I suppose, for completely open projects.
All right. And like I said, we're recording on September 10th. And I know last week there was a bit of an outage in Azure. Can either of you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a reasonably significant outage. There is actually a really good post-mortem that Buck Hodges, who's the he's the DevOps director of engineering. Yeah, that's the one. It's early in the morning where I am, so I'm getting my words together. He's the director of engineering, so he did a really kind of detailed post-mortem. I think the cause was the Azure outage that happened at the same time in the South Central region, which was triggered by literal lightning strikes in the area. So that there was comments going around internally while we were furiously trying to fix this thing, that scenario of what happens if lightning hits your data center. That's a real scenario that actually happened. And so there was a lot of stuff that did fail over. There's a lot in this postmortem, but there's a lot of stuff that did fail over, but there was a couple of areas that meant that service was massively degraded for a lot of people. So things like the authentication or the user profiles, they were stored in many places, but the check to make sure that things were alive was wrapped around all of those calls in general. So even if they were failing for one particular region, most of them were succeeding because they went somewhere else. So it didn't really trip that switch to say there's a problem here. So it's one of those things where there are a lot of small things that added up to a big outage. I would strongly suggest reading that postmortem if you're interested in it. And the best thing about it, I think, is right at the end, he's got a list of here are the next things that we are doing to prevent the problems that we discovered as a result of this. So yeah, there's definitely a looking forward aspect to this, which is kind of a very Microsoft growth culture kind of thing that we're doing at the moment, which is cool. And it's not good that outage happened, and we apologize to everybody that impacted. It's pretty bad that situation happened, but we're actually actively doing things to prevent that from happening again.
Yeah, that's what I really enjoy about Microsoft these days, is that the transparency and this was bad, this affected people, we're incredibly sorry about that, but we're taking steps to ensure that doesn't happen again. These are the lessons learned, and this is what we're going to be doing moving forward. I think that's phenomenal that Microsoft is being proactive in that way and releasing that information.
Yeah, we have always been very, very open about any type of life-side incidences that we have with BSTS and now with Azure DevOps. This is something that I'm extremely proud about at Microsoft, and specifically this engineering team, right? I think when we have a 24/7 type service that literally cannot go down because it's people's source code, it's their...
Oh no.
What happened, what we're doing to make sure this never happens again, and what we can do next time, right? So this is, like Damian said, it's a horrible thing that happened, and we do apologize like crazy. But man, when Buck tweeted the postmortem this morning, or this afternoon, I was so incredibly happy. I've been waiting for this, and it makes for an interesting read, right? One that they're talking about, which I find fascinating, which is, well, why didn't the data just fail over to another region? And then when you start reading through it, you start realizing it's a lot more complicated than just, oh, it's just a couple reads and writes that you just have to make sure it goes on to another region. It's a lot more complex, right? The STS is, or Azure DevOps is such a massive architecture. It's what we might think is incredibly easy. The more details you dive into, you start going, oh, that does make sense, right? As a code slinger, I start looking at that going, oh, it's not as easy as I first thought it was. So that's cool.
Yeah, there are a few moving parts these days in the cloud.
Yep. And when you start having to think about, the speed of light is finite, and so having live, synchronous writes in multiple regions, you actually have to start thinking about this extra, I think he mentioned at one point, 70 milliseconds of latency or something, just to enable a synchronous write. That's too big, that's too long for some of the services. You can't do that. So what's another solution to that problem? And that's the stuff that they're investigating.
Quantum entanglement.
Yes, yeah. Shift everything to Q sharp and then run quantum machines.
And Abel, you mentioned that you've known Donovan for quite a while, and you're both members of the League of, sorry, let me get the name correct, the League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates. You want to tell us a little bit about that and how that came to be?
Sure. So I've known Donovan for about 20 years now, maybe even 20 years. I mean, we've known each other through everything, like straight out of college, we've known each other. So it's a long-standing friendship that we have, and we have war stories, we have dirt on each other that just can't be filled. We're friends for life just because we have too much dirt on each other. But interesting enough, when we both went to Microsoft, we were in doing completely different stuff. But when he formed the team, when he formed it, I always told him, I was like, dude, if you ever form a team, I would love to work with you. And he's like, oh, of course, right? So he forms this team, and I think the first two people he contacted was Damian and Steven. And I didn't even know he was forming a team until I saw something on LinkedIn where he said he was looking for people. And I was like, what? What is this nonsense, right? So I ping him and I'm just like, dude, if you're looking for people, hello, I'm right here. And I'm like, if you don't want me on your team, I get that as well, because he's very picky about what he likes and what he doesn't. I'm like, that's cool, but just let me know. And he was like, no, man, I literally can't poach you. There's a rule against that. And people warn me, you cannot poach Abel. He has to come to you. And I'm like, yeah, nice cover up. I had to find out this job opening from LinkedIn. But yeah, I knew Donovan was forming a team. He wanted a team of DevOps practitioners that covered everything, right? Not just Windows, Azure DevOps, VSTS, or whatever you want to call it. Whether it's containers, Linux, open source, right? We just want to be a team of DevOps practitioners that can cover all aspects of Azure or all aspects of DevOps into Azure.
So what exactly does that entail these days? I mean, DevOps is kind of a big amorphous word that can mean different things to different people. So what is your take on it? What is your definition of the word?
Do you remember it word for word, Abel?
I'm sure I do.
Yeah, so
DevOps is something very specific. I don't need to go into my spiel.
Yeah. So Microsoft's definition, which was Donovan's definition, and apparently he spent about a month getting this definition right because he wanted to be able to back up every word that he said, and it's kind of the one that Microsoft has adopted. It's that DevOps is a union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to your end users. Is that right, Abel? Did I get it? Word for word. Yep. All right, I still have a job.
Right. Let me check Donovan right now.
Yeah. Cancel the firing. So there's two kind of points to that I like to talk about: the people, process, and products. And interestingly, because we just announced a product called Azure DevOps, it's not just the product. I mean, it's a set of tools that you can use to help with DevOps. So I really hope that nobody's looking at that thinking, oh, great, Microsoft has decided they're just selling a DevOps now. It's not that. Naming things is hard, It's a set of tools for DevOps to help you with DevOps. but the people and the process need to be part of it as well. If you have, people in your organizations who don't really believe in the idea of, continuously deploying stuff out to production as soon as it's ready, doesn't matter what tool you have, it's not going to work, right? And so the process needs to be able to support that too. If your process is, Margaret from QA needs to test all of this stuff before it goes out to production, and she works on Thursdays every 6 months, right? That's not gonna work either. You need this process around it. So that's one part. And the other thing is delivery of value. So that's really important. It doesn't necessarily mean throwing all your code straight into production. If that code's not valuable, as much as possible, you need to make sure that you can prevent it from getting to production. So it's testing. It's even when it's in production, it's things like A/B testing and gradual or progressive rollout of features and monitoring whether people are using things, being able to turn things off with feature flags and stuff like that. So interestingly, that the Azure DevOps launch today, everything was feature flagged. So it's been in production for a while, and then people just flicked the switch when it all turned on. But that delivery of value was a really core part here. So it went into production. We knew it was going to work in production because it had been there. We just needed to flick the switch for everybody once we'd proven that. So long-winded way of saying that it's really, really important that you think about production, you think about value to customers. Whether you're using Azure DevOps or Jenkins or TeamCity, Octopus Deploy, or Ansible, or whatever you're using as a product, that process and the people need to be part of it as well.
And I think the key in this is what Damian said, is continuously delivering value, right? So whatever value means, that's what DevOps encompasses. And it's been kind of interesting because I've kind of been here from the start to watch this whole progression or evolution of DevOps. I remember when I first started slinging code, we couldn't even get our code right, from one iteration to the next. So we had to adopt things like Agile to help us with the process, to figure out, okay, from one sprint to the next, can we actually deliver code that is what people want to see, that is relatively bug-free, right? So we really had to work on this whole process thing of Agile. And once we got that down, the next roadblock was, great, sprint after sprint after sprint, we're delivering code, but we're not delivering value because we can't even get the code into production. It takes like 3 or 4 days to push into production, and our sprints are only 2 weeks, which means they start overlapping. Next thing you know, we're behind, right? So then we had to figure out, okay, how can we shift that left? How can we automate a lot of this deployment more so we can deliver faster, right? So then automation and the pipelines became this huge thing. Recently, I've been running into a ton of people that they start telling me things like, oh, what about the database, right? We can now deploy our code successfully sprint after sprint, but what about our database changes? So now we have to think about things like database DevOps or securities. And we're able to push out code at a really, really fast rate now, sprint after sprint after sprint. Maybe we should pay attention to security. Where does security fall into all of this, right? So then people are now starting to talk DevSecOps or whatever the term of the moment is, right? But it's really just, as we go down this DevOps journey, we start hitting roadblocks, right? And then we just start solving them one at a time. And it's been cool to see the progression that we've made, and it's kind of cool to see what's going to happen next. But to answer your question again, what is DevOps? What does it encompass? Everything. Right? Everything that lets us deliver value faster and smoother.
I really like your emphasis on delivery there. I think that's really the kind of one of the key kind of takeaways that I would take away from your explanation. I never really thought about it that, but you mean obviously when you're developing the code, you're kind of creating it, but it doesn't actually get to anyone unless it gets delivered there, and that's really what the DevOps seems to be all about. Making sure, can we ensure that the value that's created in the development process can that get delivered on to actually the customer?
And it's not even just delivering code, right? Because we can deliver massive piles of code, sprint after sprint, feature after feature after feature. But if it's not delivering value, why are we doing that, right? Which is why that whole feedback loop is extremely important. And Damian touched on this as well when he talked about the feature flags and how we do A/B testing. That's absolutely vital, right? I mean, it's once you get your pipeline down and you can push into production pretty much on a whim, just whenever you want to. Now we have to start figuring out, are we delivering value? Right? This new feature, is it valuable? Because if it is, let's double down on it on the next sprint and do more. And if it's not, don't waste time doing this. Let's work on stuff that is providing value for our end users. So it's a lot more than just pushing code into production. It's making sure that we're delivering value.
Yeah, there's a big difference between saying, remember that piece of work that you did last week? Turns out people don't like it. It doesn't really work. There's a big difference between saying that and saying, remember that piece of work that you've been doing for the last 6 months? Yeah, it turns out people don't like that and we're not going to do it anymore.
Right.
So so the faster you can do it, the more you can learn from, from these shorter iterations. And I mean, it might work beautifully on your machine, but unless it's working in the hands of customers, you really don't know whether it's providing value or not.
So an interesting thing that we found out, and we've done quite a few experiments on this, is that whenever you do experiments with code, right, like a new feature or whatever, about 30% of those are freaking amazing. They work exactly the way you think it does. Your customers love it. Yay, we all win, right? 30% of the times I write a feature, I think it's absolutely awesome, but the public looks at it and they're like, whatever. And 30% of the time they'll look at it and just be like, oh, not only do we hate it, I don't ever want to use this product again because your code is so bad, right? And that happens to me all the time. So if experimentation is about 33%, right? If it's about a third, if we can figure out what people what direction is providing value, we can start doubling down on those. So then our future experiments are way more than just 30% of it, right? But that's how we try to trend up with that whole, how do we deliver value faster as well?
Yeah, and with the feature flags and the rollouts that you do internally, I mean, you guys are really living the things that you're speaking about, right? And I know that several of the products, or at least a lot of the presentations I've seen and heard, talk about how new features are delivered to your customers, to your users, and you dog food it internally, and then roll it out to a little bit larger circle, and then ultimately out into the hands of everyone.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting in the discussions of Agile, where you talk about a definition of done. The definition of done used to be, the code works on my machine and it passes all the tests and it's committed to source control. We kind of go a lot further than that. So not only is your definition of done dependent on it being running in production successfully, it's not considered done unless it meets the criteria that you decided beforehand for, usefulness. So it's basically an experiment. You're saying, I think that this feature that we are making right now is going to be used by people more than this other old feature. It's a feature flag that people are going to turn on and leave on. And if that's not the case, then you either abandon that feature because people aren't using it, or, it's not done until you tweak it and that experiment that you decided on to start off with is actually met. So the idea of, I've written the code, now it's done. That's like a long way back in the process, right? It has to be in production and actually being used and meet the criteria that you think it should meet.
So with that, what are the features or tools are they out there that you guys are using to kind of allow for that feedback to kind of come feedback into the products, or is it still just sort of capturing telemetry data and running it through?
Yeah, there's a lot of capturing telemetry data. I think we collect, the SCS or Azure DevOps now collects, is it something like 2 terabytes a day, Abel? Do you remember that?
Something ungodly like that. But yes, we collect massive amounts of telemetry. And in fact, a feature isn't, to Damian's point in terms of definition of done, a feature isn't done until telemetry is written to collect telemetry about that feature as well, right? That's how important it is to us.
Meta telemetry, right?
Meta telemetry. So we look at that to make sure that basically if you can't measure what you care about, then you're not going to be able to learn from it. You're not going to be able to judge whether this has been a success or not. So you need to have that measurement as part of your deployment, I guess, as part of that feature.
So are you building tools where that telemetry can then be fed back into sort of the Azure DevOps tooling sets, or there,
Yeah,
or is that
you can do
existing
that.
already?
Yeah, you can do that. I'm not sure whether we do that. The problem is we did a lot of this stuff before there were great tools and great integration. So a lot of it is hand rolled. Like our feature flags, for example, are controlled by PowerShell scripts. We turn them on and off using PowerShell, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there's a lot of products out there now that you could use for feature flags, and I would probably not recommend rolling your own. Even though it just seems like an if statement, just use somebody else's work, right?
I'll go one step further than Damian. I don't just strong message it. Don't roll your own. Use either a library that exists or a service that exists, because the edge cases will kill you. And plus, you don't want, that's not the software that you write, right? Then you're gonna have to maintain this tool forever. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah. So application insights, I think we do use though. Is that right, Abel?
Yeah.
And it's extremely powerful. I mean, you can set up expectations in terms of pipelines that you expect people to go through. So you expect, if people have this flag turned on, that this is the pathway they will choose through your application. And you can see drop-offs of, they got to this stage and only 40% of people continued the way we expected. Clearly there is something wrong there. And then I think application insights allows you to add like automated stuff on there, like if there's exceptions or if something hasn't met your expectations, then it can actually create work items in Azure DevOps, in your Azure boards, it is now. So you can actually get it to create work items for your team to go and look at if you've met certain thresholds automatically, which is kind of cool. In practice, I've done this before. In practice, you have to be careful about those, because I've been in teams before where, if you have an exception, it'll raise a thing. You get 400 exceptions in a day, and then suddenly, it's ruined. Your board looks like a disaster, and you have to write scripts to get rid of stuff. So it's useful. Like if you tune this stuff really nicely, it's useful to get that notification. But yeah, you do have to be careful with the automated stuff.
Fair enough. One of the things we ask everyone that comes on is just for them to give some advice that they would kind of share, nuggets of wisdom that they might have to people that are getting started. That's one of a large portion of our audience are people that are just kind of breaking into the industry or just trying to kind of accelerate kind of their growth as an individual. Do you guys have some words of advice that you would individually give to someone who wants to do that?
So I'll jump in really quickly. So I have 2 kids, and I tried to cram computer science down both of their throats, and it worked for my daughter, and my son was just like, no, I'm gonna do So, but what I told my daughter is, if you're gonna be slinging code, I hope you love it, because the way you get good at it is by writing code, and writing a lot of code, and writing it all the time. Whether it has to do with your work or not, I remember, especially when I first started, and I'm old and tired now, so I don't work nearly that hard. But back in the day, on the weekends, guess what I'd be doing? Writing code, because that's what I love to do. On my free time, I would write more code. People would be like, oh, you want to go out? And I'd be like, yeah, but this is almost done. Let me finish. And of course, 3 days later, it would be finished. But I thought it was going to be done in 3 seconds, right? But that's kind of what you need to do to be good, is just write a lot of code. So if they're going to be coders, love it and write a lot, everything.
I would almost say that that's not entirely necessary. I mean, you're going to have an awesome career if you love doing that. And I'm kind of in the same boat as Abel. I think I wrote my first piece of code when I was 10 on an Amiga 500, just writing little games. And that was cool. And I was kind of hooked. I went away from it for a little while. And again, like Abel, I did music for a year and then realized that you can't make any money doing that. So I came back to computer science. But there are a lot of people in the industry who write really good code day to day who don't go home and like work on their own private projects and things. And that's okay. That's fine. It's fantastic if you absolutely love the career and you write a lot of code. What I would say is I would encourage you to kind of follow the path of the things that you're interested in. So be open to new stuff that you see, read a little bit about a different area of software or a different area of technology. And then if that interests you, give it a try, because you might turn out to love it. So both Abel and I do a lot of public speaking at the moment. And I was like most people when I was a kid and when I was at school, I hated public speaking. Just like really, really did not like it. At one point, there was a user group near me and they asked whether I wanted to talk about a particular thing that I'd done. And I tried it again and loved it. But if I'd stuck to that kind of idea of, no, I hate public speaking, I hate speaking in front of other people, I wouldn't have gone down the career path that I have gone down now, where it's essentially my job to do this stuff. But the same thing goes for the technology. I tried .NET, and Abel was saying this as well. He tried .NET because he was open to, hey, I might give this thing a go. Maybe you'll look at the UI side of the stuff you're doing and saying, actually, I'm really interested in how to make these websites look a bit nicer and cleaner. So maybe I'll go down that path. So that'd be my advice. Like, be open to new things, new parts of technology, and then follow them if they're interesting to you. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of breadth in this industry, and that will lead to this excitement that Abel was talking about. If it's writing code, you'll write a lot of code because you love it, right? If it's design stuff, you'll do tons of design work. Like you'll sit there and make websites better, which I am not. This is not me, but yeah, following those parts and being open to different sides of the industry, I think, is really important.
Very cool.
I think the only thing I'd throw onto that is, because that is great advice. You don't have to be insane about work like me. But I will say this: the one thing that has served me incredibly well in this industry is it changes all the time. Technology is changing all the time, and we each have that little part of us where we're like, oh, do I really want to learn another freaking JavaScript framework? Or do I really want to learn a whole new technology stack? Right? I already know how to do everything this way. Why do I want to do something else? But I will never forget, on my very first job, I was working in compact computers. And there's some old distinguished engineer that was just like, Java, that's stupid. I can do everything using C++. I will never use that language. It will never go anywhere. And I remember thinking, being extremely young back then, I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Now, as I get older, I catch myself in that same mode of thought, right? But I have to remind myself all the time, you always have to keep on learning. So if I look at everything that I learned from my university, I don't use a single thing that I learned at the uni. The only thing that I use is how to learn new technology, how to learn new things. That's absolutely vital. So if you're going to be in this field, don't get too attached to one technology stack or one language or one whatever, because it's constantly going to be changing and you're going to have to constantly learn. And when you stop learning, that's when you have to retire, right? Because then the technology is going to blow right past you.
They really should have a college course, Learning to Learn, because that would be the most valuable course that you would find at college.
That is the most valuable thing that I learned from college.
Yeah, same. Yep.
So another quick question. People, and maybe this is not that quick, but do you have any resources, people that are just trying to get into DevOps, that you would kind of point them to get into, or some great tool documentation, posts, books, anything like that?
Yeah, I was literally asked this question yesterday. And so I would recommend it for the Microsoft side of things, and it's a little bit more broad than that, but aka.ms/DevOps. That's kind of the landing page for Microsoft stuff. And when you go there, there's probably about 6 different sections, but one is Learn DevOps, and it's a broad kind of, this is what DevOps is, and this is how you can do it. There's Learn Agile, and then there's Learn Git, I think is the other one, because that's pretty useful. That's a really good starting point. For the Microsoft stuff, docs.microsoft.com is kind of the starting point for any of our stuff. And we have been working super hard on getting that stuff good. So if there's anything that's missing or anything that's unclear, definitely hit us or pretty much anybody at Microsoft up, and we'll try to make that better. DevOps in general, I don't know. Anything else that you've got? Oh, actually, one more thing that you should definitely absolutely read is the State of DevOps report. sponsored primarily by Google Cloud Platform, but also by AWS and Microsoft and a bunch of other companies. And it's about 80 pages, something like that. But it's really, really rich information. And what they do, it's an organization called DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. And it's run by Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Gene Kim, who wrote the Phoenix Project, which I would also recommend you read. And who's the other one? Jez Humble. So they basically get data from around 30 or 40,000 different teams about how they work, and they use that data to do cluster analysis and group teams into whether they're high-performing software delivery teams, medium or low-performing. And there's a ton of metrics out there in how fast these teams work if they're doing these specific things. So everything from like how fast they actually get stuff into production to how quickly they can fix an outage, all the way down to burnout. Like if you do this stuff properly, you're far less likely to have people on your team burn out. And they're far more likely to recommend your company as a good place to work. But all backed by data. It's an amazing report. I would strongly, strongly recommend just giving it a read and then waiting a few days and reading it again because it's pretty dense.
Okay. And then how about just Twitter plugs or any social media plugs for yourselves? Where can people follow you?
Well, I am Damo Visa on Twitter, so DAMOVISA. Twitter is like the main place to get hold of me. I'm on Twitter about 29 hours a day. It's a time zone thing, I think. And then Abel, your Twitter mainly as well?
My alias is Abel Squidhead. I'm probably the only one that has a handle like that remotely close. Just search it and you'll find it. And like Damian, I'm on Twitter all the time. If you send me email, it's going to totally get lost because I never read my emails. You send me a message on Twitter, I'm going to see that within like 10 minutes.
Cool. Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys coming on.
No problem. Good to be here.
That was Abel Wang and Damian Brady. Abel Wang is a senior cloud developer advocate specializing in DevOps and Azure with the background in application development. Damian is an Australian CDA specializing in DevOps. He's now back in Australia, the land of the dangerous creatures and beautiful beaches.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.